Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our lesser spotted Monday morning webinar, where Chris and I will be talking all about how to nail the basics of building your employer brand. We were meant to have Rosie from Mila on our webinar this morning as well, but sadly she has gone down with both COVID and pneumonia at the same time. So obviously wishing her a very speedy recovery, but understandably she had to cancel on this morning. So you've only got Chris and me chatting. Luckily, Chris knows a hell of a lot all about in kind of employer brand and building a brilliant EVP. So absolutely, we'll still have a very informative webinar with hopefully lots and lots of actionable points. Just some brief kind of housekeeping. Any questions that you have, please pop them into the kind of question box there, and I will go through them towards the end. So the format will be kind of half an hour, 40 minutes of discussion, where Chris and I will run through different questions that we've already had in advance from people, and also run through the topics that we've got around EVP, employer brand, flexibility, diversity, all of that. And then we'll come to your questions for that last kind of half an hour or 20 minutes and answer as many as possible. So please do drop them in as you're kind of listening and feel inspired to do so. So first of all, Chris, I will let you introduce yourself and Mars as well.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm very happy to be here, and it's a real shame. I know I've known Rosie for years, so that would have been great, but hopefully I can offer some value to everyone in the meantime as well. I always have to say, ignore my Christmas themed mug. If you see me drinking out of it, I don't have the month wrong. I just picked up the wrong mug for my coffee. So very happy to be here. My name is Chris Woods. I am regional recruitment marketing and I&D lead for Mars. So I cover what is essentially our EMEA region, but we call our Europe, India, Middle East and South Africa region. So that covers about 13 countries across Europe, Middle East and South Africa. Essentially my job is to build excellent recruitment marketing campaigns that enable us to hire groups of talent and build the strategy around recruitment marketing, and also build our strategy around how we build the top of the funnel when it comes to diversity recruiting as well. So I think for those of you who don't know Mars, which will be, I think a few of you will no doubt know our corporate brands. So we are 140,000 associates across the globe. We have 4,000 in the UK. So the UK is a big market for us. We operate across a few different segments. So the one everyone will know is chocolate and confectionery. So we have brands like the Mars bar, unsurprisingly, M&M's, Snickers. We also have gum in there as well. So things like Extra, Orbit, Hubba Bubba, etc. We have pet care, which is brands like Whiskers, Pedigree, Royal Canin. We also then have Mars Food, which is Ben's Original, Dolmio, a few other brands in there. And then the kind of one that shocks everyone is we are one of the world's largest veterinary services providers. So here in the UK, we own a vet services brand called Linnaeus. We have a couple across Europe and across the globe as well.
Brilliant, thank you very much. I've also just been notified that there is no comments box in here, so people cannot put their questions in. We will try and fix that. I don't know why that's happened. But if you could, if you would like to ask a question, then please do drop me a message on LinkedIn and I will field them from there. If you can be logged in on LinkedIn on the side, then that's all they can work for now until we fix the comments box there. So I'll introduce myself as well. So for those of you who don't know me, and maybe this is your kind of first webinar with Flexa, I am Molly. I am the CEO and one of the co-founders of Flexa as well. Flexa has existed since about 2 weeks before the pandemic, and we are the platform where every flexible company gets discovered for exactly what kind of working environment they offer. So hence why this is so closely linked to kind of employer brand and EVP. I always tell the story of why we started Flexa, because I think it makes it quite relevant in terms of the work that we do. But I actually started off my career in investment banking, left university and went into investment banking. Obviously totally unrelated to what I do now. But I worked in investment banking for about 18 months. And during that time, I also found out that I had quite severe autoimmune disease. That meant that sometimes I can't walk. So like my feet swell up, my hands swell up, my face swells up. Not a nice thing to have to go into the office with at all, but I was able to work. So I kind of struggled through for 18 months, not really realizing that, working from home was possible. This was also back in like 2015, 16. So it was much less common then. And after about 18 months, they told me that I could put in a request to work from home 1 day a week or when I needed to, which was roughly that much. After about 10 days waiting for that to go through, they pulled me into a room, put a settlement package in front of me, sacked me, and told me to leave immediately. So I then thought that asking for flexible working was a terrible thing to do, and that ultimately I wouldn't be able to do a full-time role because I needed sometimes to not go into an office. I then went through the kind of job hunting process, not being able to find out where offered just 1 day a week from home, and met hundreds of other people in a really similar position. And when we look at kind of pre-COVID stats, around 30% of people said that flexible working was a non-negotiable back then. That was predominantly people with disabilities and conditions like me, or working mothers who obviously needed that flexibility to shoulder that burden of care that women still ultimately do have. I then eventually did find a genuinely flexible company after a lot of hunting and asked them why they didn't showcase it. And they said, well, there's nowhere to showcase exactly what we offer and advertise that to people. So hence why the idea of kind of Flexa came through. We've now got 1.7 million users using Flexa, clicking those filters to understand exactly what kind of flexible working environment that company that they're looking at offers. Ultimately, we act a bit like an employer brand platform that brings your flexible working environment to the very forefront of your employer brand. Mars are flexified and scored brilliantly. They've been flexified for about a year now, I think. Is it, Chris?
Pretty much our anniversary at the moment, I think.
Yeah. Mars use Flexa to showcase the fact that they are ultimately a very inclusive employer. Hybrid working, flexible hours, some dog-friendly offices as well. But Chris, I'd love to hear a bit more about, obviously I've done that kind of vague intro of flexibility, but what does flexibility mean to Mars?
Yeah, and I think starting off by saying flexibility for us is about, it's more than just benefits. It's kind of embedded in our culture. And I think that's kind of the journey we've been on, particularly since COVID. So before COVID, we did have flexible working practices. It was probably slightly less, what's the best way of describing it? Slightly less shared and understood by our associates, because it was kind of not a thing. People didn't really share, exactly to your point, Molly, people didn't really share what they did, and it was case by case basis. So I worked from home. I think I remember getting a puppy who, if anyone follows me on LinkedIn, will definitely have seen Barney, and he's been in a lot of that Flexa content over the last year as well. I remember getting him January 2020, and having the flexibility to kind of have a couple of days at home with him. Little did I know I would have a lot of time at home with him in the following months. But for us, that's about just offering just different practices and policies which enable our associates to do the work they want to do. I think it's about treating them like adults and trusting them and giving them responsibility. The one thing I always say is we work to live, not live to work. And so I think that's what flexibility is about for us. It's about enabling our associates to come to work, to be themselves and be their authentic selves, and be able to do great work and go home and be proud of the work they've done, but not burn themselves out, and not have all of that kind of dramatic side that comes from overworking people, which is not what we want to do at all.
Yeah, most productive selves come when there's also a balance of life and feeling like you have time to enjoy things outside of work as well. And you obviously talk about kind of your hybrid approach and flexible hours, and I think it's very interesting because often hybrid gets a bit of a, I don't know, unfair rap sometimes. But actually, I think what people forget is that flexibility is a spectrum, right? It goes from 1 day a week from home, which choice to work from home 1 day a week, all the way through to you can work wherever, whenever, whatever. And what I find very interesting about that kind of, it's a very binary debate of like it's remote versus in person, and people don't seem to allow for in between. But actually, what most people want is an in between. Like my ideal is going into the office twice a week. Like I enjoy that. I find that gives me enough freedom kind of on the sides of it to work in a way that I'm most productive. Other people want to work fully remotely and have a team meet up once a quarter. And so that's how they get their in-person time. Other people want to go in 4 days a week because they've got screaming children at home, but they'd like flexible hours in order to be able to do that. So I think, as we go through this webinar talking about employer brand and flexibility, I'd like everybody kind of listening to think of it as that fluid spectrum, whatever you've got, whether that's 3 days a week in the office, 2 days a week from home, all the way through to fully remote, occasional meetups, and everything in between. That is all flexibility. You are still offering somebody a choice of working. And it's about empowering people to make an educated decision about whether that's the right place for them to work or not by being transparent, which kind of brings me to my first question for you, Chris, around how working environment and flexibility leads into employer branding.
Yeah, I think so. To kind of answer, you kind of got to define what an employer brand is, I guess, and that is, if I really simplify it, it's what people are saying about your organisation. The way I always kind of talk about it is your employer brand is what someone says, or the way you respond when someone says to you, "Oh, Molly, you work at Flexa, what's that like?" That's your employer brand in real simple terms. And I think flexibility is so important. And you summed it up perfectly when you kind of say flexibility has this kind of undertone of that means you're at home all the time. And if you're in the office at any point, that's not flexibility. But flexibility is what we're enabling. So I keep saying associates, but employees, colleagues, however you call your associates, it's enabling them to do their best work and giving them what they need to be able to do that. And so if you're telling people how they need to work, where they need to work, when they need to work, you're not only not getting the best version of them necessarily, but if they're tired and they have this bad feeling after, this really long week, and don't get me wrong, we all have long weeks where we've got deadlines and stress, but if that's constant, you're either going to lose those people, or when they get asked that question, what's it like to work at Flexa? What's it like to work at Mars? They kind of might roll their eyes or have that little break or that telltale sigh. And that's telling a lot of people what it's like to work there. And so for us, when we think about our employer brand, it's about how does someone respond when they say Mars? And we really want them to be kind of, oh yeah, excited. I love working at Mars, because that's what's going to spread. And that's the content you get. That's the authentic message you get. And that's then what you can go and share. I always say kind of what we call associate advocacy, employee generated content, however you want to call it, is one of the most valuable parts of your employer brand or your employer reputation, because it's truly what's coming from the heart, that's coming from your staff.
Yeah.
And that's just so vital. It's just so vital.
Totally agree with all of those points. The question bar is here now. Some people were saying it was always there, but I couldn't see it. So the chat tab, where please feel free to kind of chat and ask questions in the bit below. So there's a chat tab, and then underneath it is Q&A, and that should be on the far right of the screen. Sorry that wasn't appearing for everybody before, but hopefully we've fixed it. So yeah, any questions, please pop them in there, and we'll come to them at the end. But to come back to that kind of what is employer brand point, I think a lot of people see employer branding as this very complicated, difficult to execute, mysterious thing. And I think it's basically just marketing your EVP. And marketing isn't easy by any stretch of the imagination at all. But ultimately, if you've got the ingredients of an EVP, which ultimately is what your company offers in terms of working environment, benefits, compensation, progression, and then also the kind of softer bits, like what is your culture like in terms of reward and recognition, personal development, does that matter? Mission and vision obviously become very important, but it's the items that make your company, and there is no right or wrong answer to what an EVP is. Like if you are a fully office-based company with a really, really work hard, play hard culture, but you're going to pay people really, really well for that, that's your EVP, and that's what you need to showcase and run with. Because I think what a lot of people forget when we talk about employer branding is not meant to appeal to everybody. It's meant to appeal to the people that are going to thrive in your working environment. Just as you said, Chris, like there are the ways that people work best and you can get the most out of people, but that same way of working is not out of everybody. So when you think about employer branding, like just the same as you don't want everybody to buy a certain product, it should be thinking about your company in a very, very similar way, appealing to like-minded people that are going to thrive in those kind of environments. So when I kind of talk to companies about where flexibility fits into their EVP and employer brand, if you're a really flexible company, then it should be central. It should be one of the most important things that you lean on, because when you look at Gen Z and millennials in particular, and they asked, what 3 things, assuming salary is fair, what 3 things matter the most to you when you're looking at your next company? Number 1 is flexibility, by like quite a long way. Number 2 is mission or vision. Like, am I working for a company that I'm excited by what they're doing, or maybe they're making their social or environmental good somewhere in there. And the third one is progression and development as well, which is actually quite a new one. A lot of previous generations kind of cared less about the L&D side, I suppose. And then there are others that kind of come into it too, a bit lower down, around like diversity. Am I actually working with a diverse group of people, etc. So it's working out within those kind of top 3 things and who you want to appeal to. Like, what does your company offer, and making sure that you're marketing it in the places that the people you want to see it will see it. So it might not, Indeed job platform might not be the right place for you, because you might not want to hire those kind of people or whatever. So to kind of continue onto that, Chris, when you think about employer branding, where do you showcase Mars's employer brand?
Yeah, and I think just to add to something you said there, I love there's 2 things. I love it's about thriving, and I think so many people view it as and to be fair, I think even earlier in my career, when I hadn't necessarily found the right role for me, I was maybe trying to shoehorn myself into a company. But it's about how you thrive and not just survive. And the second one there, and I've already forgotten your question, so I have to go back to that in a second. But the second one there is, everyone has an employer brand. Whether you're using that or not is an entirely separate question. But as I say, it's about your employer brand is what people are saying about you already, and you already have that. So it's your Glassdoor reviews, it's how people talk internally, it's what they expect, it's whether people love this element of it. There's no wrong thing to your employer brand. It's kind of what fits you. But Molly, you'll have to ask your question again, because my memory is like a sieve.
So where does Mars showcase your employer brand?
Yeah, so for us, I mean, to be really transparent, we have such a wide variety of roles. And so for us, one big challenge here, we operate, as I said, across veterinary services, pet care, confectionery. We also we have, if I just think about the kind of markets we have in the UK and the sites, we have pet centre, we have numerous factories, we have numerous offices, we have kind of data science hubs, all of this kind of stuff. So there's loads of different elements to what we do. I think for us, it was about really taking, whilst there are different roles and different roles will need different job boards, is around really taking what is important in, and I always love saying this, but culture add, not culture fit. So we want people to add to our culture from a diversity perspective. So how can we find people to add to our culture? How can we find people that are going to thrive and not just survive in our culture? And also, how can we not be afraid to just say, okay, you might not be right at Mars, and that's fine. That's what this process is for. An interview, I always say, is both for us to decide whether someone fits, but also for them to decide whether Mars is a fit for them. And so I think certainly when we looked at Flexa, we advertise and try and be on platforms where that talent is. And so Flexa was a natural choice for us when we signed up a year ago. What platforms align with who we are and what we do? LinkedIn's a great platform for us because we can get that content sharing piece on there. I think sometimes job boards have their place, but sometimes having something with a little bit more. So LinkedIn's great in that you have the social side of it. And so someone's just kind of shared something around employee generated content, but that's amazing. Like that for us is our employer brand, being able to share that. So LinkedIn, Flexa, it's about advertising on keywords on Google and really showcasing if someone's searching, I don't know, flexible careers or dog-friendly offices or things like that. It's about making sure we're appearing in those places, the places where people are looking for that, and we're not trying to shoehorn ourselves into job boards that just look for people that want to be in the office all the time, or people that want a culture where, at Mars we're a very trusted culture. So there is responsibility. We have our 5 principles. One of those is mutuality. So what's fair for us also has to be fair for a stakeholder. So in this case, a candidate. So we want to make sure we're on platforms which are going to give that. And it's not people looking for something we're not. And it's really owning who we are and who we're looking for, and not just trying to appeal to everybody. Because not only does that create the wrong type of hires, it also really just overworks your recruiters. If they're just having to filter through tons of wrong candidates, it's wasting recruiters' time, it's wasting the candidates' time, and it's just trying to be just honest about who we are, really.
Yeah, absolutely agree with that. I think, one interesting way that I've always kind of thought about employer brand and hiring is around considering your hiring funnel to be a marketing funnel. So what I mean by that is, imagine in a normal marketing funnel, you've got your conversion at the bottom to being an employee. You've got your kind of applications here, which is your kind of moving them down the middle of funnel activity. And then you have at the top here your employer branding. Traditionally, the hiring funnel has only had those bottom 2 levels, which is just like try and get as many applicants as possible and convert them into being employees. That's actually an incredibly inefficient way of doing it. Because if you think about trying to get those people to apply, if there aren't hundreds of thousands of people that have heard of you, which is obviously a nice problem that you have, is you've probably got so many people that have heard of you that sometimes you'll get, very high volumes of applications aren't necessarily quite right. But also you want to make sure that, I know we've talked about this before, but what Mars wants to do is appeal to the right kind of talent, diverse talent that will be that culture add, which does require you appealing to an even broader pool of people that may not otherwise consider you as an employer of choice. So whenever I'm talking about employer brand, I always talk about you might not have marketing budgets, which I know is a question that's been asked here, is how do we start marketing? We've got no budgets. Take some budget out of this middle of funnel and move it up. Because as much as it might feel like you can't track applications and it's a bit more fuzzy, it will make it more efficient, because you've got hundreds of thousands of people seeing you here, converting into hundreds or maybe thousands if you're lucky in that middle, and then pulling them down. But you're dealing with people that are warmed up, they love your company, they know exactly what you're about in terms of your working environment, culture, things that matter to you. So they're going to be, to use marketing terminology, very warm. And if you told a marketer to just convert cold leads, they'd look at you like you were mad. You want warm, excited, potential talent that loves exactly what you do. And it's becoming more and more common that people will have lists of ideal companies that they eventually really, really want to work for. And we see it all the time at Flexa, because we've never spent a penny on hiring. We've never used a recruiter. We've never used the traditional job platform. We've only ever used Flexa to hire now over 20 people in the last couple of years. And the reason that we can do that is because we have hundreds, if not that actually, we have thousands of people sitting there that really want to work for us when we do eventually open up that role. They know exactly what we're about. They know about our mission. They know about our working environment. And I cannot recommend companies enough to go and do exactly that same thing of that employer brand up here, and go and just spend a bit of money on platforms that will enable you to build that employer brand. And LinkedIn for that is free as well. As you mentioned, Chris, the employee advocacy piece and the story sharing. And I know there's a question about it that we'll answer later. It's free on LinkedIn. And you can get really amazing employee advocacy and reach through that too. Was just going to point out this kind of green CCA at the very bottom is if you are interested in understanding kind of the components of EVP and what you should be shouting about in terms of your employer brand, please do take our little benchmarking quiz down there. It's completely free and takes 2 minutes. You just tell us all about your kind of benefits and working environment. And the quiz will tell you where you're really strong, where you should be shouting about, where there's some potential opportunities as well. So if you are interested in kind of starting to shout about different pieces of EVP at that very top of funnel, then please do take that benchmarking and it'll hopefully give you a steer on some interesting places to start. Conscious that we're actually coming up to almost halfway. Been chatting a lot already.
Okay.
I was going to ask you, obviously, because you have been key in building Mars's very, very strong employer brand, and looking back at all of your experience with that, what piece of advice would you give to our listeners on building an employer brand from scratch? What are the kind of key foundations?
Yeah. My mind immediately goes to being humble. There's an amazing team of people at Mars that have all built the employer brand here over the. It's been a lot of work over many years. I think my key advice would be break it down into three. And the number one, absolutely most important part of that is ask your employees. So, and I always say here as well, don't just ask your most engaged employees. That's probably the easiest go-to, and it's really tough. We did a full wide survey, so we renewed our EVP earlier this year, and that came from a survey that went to all of our associates. Ask people of diversity as well. So ask working parents, ask people that are new to your business, ask people that have been there for a long time. Try and get this really big view and as many different opinions as possible, and ask them what is unique about. So I would go to people and say, what do you think is unique about working at Mars? What do you think? What keeps you here? Why did you join in the first place? What makes you stay? If someone asks you whether you recommend Mars, what do you say? If someone asks you what the good things and the bad things about working for Mars are, what do you say? Really build a picture there. Then go to social listening. So look through your hashtags, look through your Glassdoor profile, but really key, also look through the interview notes. So obviously in Glassdoor you have the kind of employee review, but you also have the interview review, and really look, because those interview review ones have some real nuggets of information in there, because quite a lot of the time I go on there and it'll be maybe someone said, and I look for other businesses as well, someone said X thing was kind of different to what I'd seen. Really work out what that is, and then work out what your content and what you're sharing externally is different to what they're seeing, and start to build that picture. And then do some focus groups and kind of take that content and say to groups of people, okay, if we were to share this piece of content, how would that make you feel? And also, it's something I'm looking at doing now, is that external piece. So ask people what their first impression of your business was, what they think from your careers website, what they think from your social medias, from your employee generated content, and start to really build a picture of kind of stages, I guess, of what people think when they join, and in that joining process and that onboarding, what people see through that onboarding when that kind of honeymoon period has ended and you're getting into the I've got to talk budget and all of that kind of stuff, and they're a little bit more kind of embedded. And then talk to people as they've left, and talk to people that don't even know your business and maybe have considered applying. Build that into something, but don't go big. Do 2 or 3 key points. So for Mars, it's people, purpose, and development. So we have amazingly talented people who are all kind of moving towards one mission at Mars. We have our purpose, which is embedding the world we want tomorrow starts with how we do business today, our 5 principles, what we call the associate concept. And then the development piece is, as a business, we put a lot of time, effort, and resource into developing people both professionally and personally. So it's not just about kind of, do you move up in your role? It's how we make you feel about building yourself, and whether that's learning or whether that's just generally kind of thinking, okay, what are my strengths and development areas, and how do I build them? Do you have a solid BDP process? That's how we did it. But I'd say the number one thing is just listen to people, ask people, and listen to people.
Yeah. The kind of employee advocacy and also candidate experience side of things are so crucial. When I think about the kind of foundations of employer brand, it's ultimately, in my mind, it's your EVP, which we've talked about before, and the constituent parts within that. your employee advocacy, like how people are talking about you, the stories that they have, what they say when they're at a party and they're asked where they work and what it's like. And then also, I do think there's the kind of softer side of that culture, like what kind of person do you want to attract in their marketing in those spaces? I think there's a tendency for companies to think that what they have is not enough, or that they don't have enough of a team in order to do it as well. But every company, every individual has the power to do employer branding without a social team, without budget, without anything. Ultimately, it is about talking about why your company is a good place to work, in places that people will see it. Like, it's literally as simple as that.
And everyone's got an employer brand as well. So it's, you either own that rhetoric or you don't.
Yeah, it already.
You either have someone, whether that's a dedicated job like mine is, or you have, you know, someone in marketing, someone in talent, wherever it may sit, public affairs, all of that kind of stuff. There is already, and there are already people talking about your business. That sounds really daunting when I say it like that, but quite oftentimes good as well. There will be some bad, but I think sometimes it's about just kind of being ready to hear that bad, and being open to make those changes, or owning. I think, Molly, you said it, like, if you want to be in the office 5 days a week, you have this work hard, play hard culture, own it if that's who you are. But yeah, you've got an employer brand, so just kind of put anything you have. It doesn't need to be this big budget, a huge team. Just find some resource or something for someone to do. And usually there's someone really passionate about that, wants to get into marketing, or wants to do social media or something like that, that would happily do that as a passion project to start.
Absolutely. As soon as you become an employer, you have an employer brand. So, like, as soon as you got one employee, you have an employer brand at that point. In terms of kind of starting from scratch as well, I think when we talk about EVP and employer brand, it could be like, okay, but where do I actually start? And my advice is, like, get everyone that has an opinion on it, which may be everyone in your company, but like, choose some key stakeholders, sit down and be like, right, what with the pillars of working environment, benefits, culture, salary, break it down into 7 areas. And I'm happy to share the way that I've kind of discussed this in my newsletter. I'll drop it into the chat in a second. Get them into a room and get them to write the good, the bad, the ugly, everything on Post-it notes and put it all down. Then collect those common themes and turn that into a way that you explain it in your company, like recruitment marketing. And recruitment marketing is also like how you write it in a job description. Like, it's not just like actual marketing. It's how do you write it in a job description? How do you write it on your careers page? How do you write it in a LinkedIn post that you share about whether you're hiring? How do you write it in an employee handbook, onboarding? So turning it into very easy to digest copy, and then putting that across as many places as possible. Like, obviously there's platforms like Flexa, where we will do kind of all of that for you, verify your flexibility, give you a platform to be discovered by millions of people, and do your employer brand marketing for you. So become an extension of that team. But there's also the possibility for, you know, how do you start employee sharing on LinkedIn? Just do it yourself, first of all. You went for a nice walk with a dog at lunchtime and you had the freedom to do that, post about it. People love stories, and it might feel like it feels boring, but actually it's quite engaging to understand how people work, particularly if people don't have access to that level of flexibility. It's quite inspiring as well. Just start sharing about it on LinkedIn and you'll see it snowball from there. But I think it's very easy to want to go down the very measurable track of, like, if I put a job description out, then I'll get all of these applications. And it's like, you see from an action you've had all of this return. But actually, you need to be very consistent in employer branding. Sometimes you won't see an immediate impact. It takes time to build up that marketing awareness. But over time, it will mean that all of those layers below it become much more efficient and effective. And you probably will have better retention and engagement because you've hired the kind of people that really wanted to work for you as a company, rather than just machine gun approach to applying to jobs, because that's the easiest way to do it. So it has a positive, employer brand has a positive internal effect as well as external. So I cannot state strongly enough how worth it is to just start posting on LinkedIn and getting what you stand for as a company from an EVP perspective down on paper, because it's very important. People care. So before we go over to questions, we've got loads of questions in, which is brilliant. finish with a kind of question that you've partially answered, but flipping it to more internal is like on the inside of a company, especially like a very large company like Mars, how do you make sure that your employer brand and all of that flexibility and great stuff that you're shouting about is actually a reality for your employees?
Yeah, I think that one's one of the most difficult. Especially the bigger you go, you've got pockets of people who are always going to be teams that, and actually one of the biggest examples we have is that we have retail workers in M&M's world, and in London as an example, we have factory workers who all have a slightly different need out of their job. And so having this one employer brand that works for everyone is really difficult. When it comes to making sure people know about policies and what we do from a flexibility standpoint, some big businesses we have a wellbeing team, but actually our resource level on that is still relatively lean as well. But it's just, I guess, about you will understand that about having those conversations, because in that you can ask. So if I think about one of our policies, we have equal parental leave. So regardless of gender, every new parent at Mars will get 6 months of paid leave. And it's actually a shame Rosie's not here, because Rosie's the one that implemented that policy at Mars. So if she's watching, shout out to Rosie for that amazing policy. That necessarily isn't one that everyone knows about, because if you're at a different stage in your career, you're not thinking about having children, that may have kind of glossed over. So I think one way is having excellent internal communications around policies. So having an internal HR system of some sort which shares those policies, but also line manager training, I think, is one of the most important things. So line managers are, whether we like it or not, your line of defense, and it's probably your weakest point when it comes to sharing policies and flexible working. You can have a policy, and whether that's flexible working, so you only work core hours as an example, the rest you can kind of slot in how you like. If there's one line manager that's saying to people, no, that's not what we do in our team, or you can't do that, and we're a little bit different to X team, that's your weakest link.
Yeah.
Because that person's going to share with other teams and other managers, and so I think really training line managers, we have different training methods internally, but for us it's really key about sharing that policy and making sure that they're communicating with their associates effectively. But also, let's kind of be honest, not every team is different as well. So there are some teams that can offer more flexibility. So I think that's a really difficult part when you get big.
Yeah.
But working with the business and make sure line managers are talking to their associates, meeting individual needs, and just being human about it.
Yeah.
I think that the example, obviously I've heard a couple of times, of how you kind of started Flexa is one that always gets me, because it was just not a nice experience. Whereas realistically, what is the impact of you doing that when you think about, were you engaged? No. Where are the people within that business going to go, oh, Molly gets a day off a week, and so I want that, and start kicking off us? Probably not. So it's just about kind of education on why flexibility is important with line managers, and being able to read the signs of individual needs as well. Because from a diversity perspective, you're never going to enable diverse talent in your business if they can't join your business and thrive, and they're only there and in survival mode constantly. You're never going to get the best out of people. And I said, so I think long story and long answer there, but line managers is an amazing way of making sure they're engaged and bought into that policy as well.
Totally agree with that. I think you saying that that's the weakest link is very true. I think also it kind of opens up a wider conversation about how do companies prevent that happening. Obviously, managerial training is very important. And I think your point of saying like some teams can be more flexible than others is absolutely true. And I think it becomes particularly difficult when we're an organization like Mars, where it's like you've got your office roles, and then obviously you've got your supply chain and retail workers as well. But if we just take office or kind of, what would be traditionally in office roles. I think one thing that companies have to do to avoid that kind of managerial mismatch sometimes that happens is make a minimum commitment to that flexibility. So a company needs to say, it may vary across teams. Like tech is nearly always more flexible than sales, for example. But across teams, there may be variance, but we have made a minimum commitment as a company to say that everybody that works in our office-based roles can work from home 1 day a week or 2 days a week. So then at least everybody knows that there is a minimum of where they can stand, and there's therefore kind of limited variance that one manager can create because you've made a minimum commitment within that. And I think it's all well and good going, we let our teams decide, but that's where that weakest link can really come in. And there does need to be a top-down directorate. Could be really vague, like everyone is able to work from home 2 days a week, and then it might vary around that. Or everyone has core hours of 11 till 4. It might vary around that. But being very clear on that minimum expectation or minimum offering, I think is a really important foundation to make sure that your company is consistent and truly flexible for managers. And to your point around diversity, like you cannot have an inclusive company without offering flexibility. It is impossible. Because if you look at the importance of flexibility to diverse groups. So for women, 92% of women say that flexibility is crucial to them. 96% of people with disabilities and conditions say that flexibility is crucial, and 96% of people of colour as well. So it's not just the obvious, like, you have a disability, so you need to be able to work from home sometimes. Also, sometimes it's about belonging and feeling safe at work as well, because plenty of people of colour, different sexual orientations, face a lot of microaggressions at work that are exhausting to have to face up to every single day of the week. So inclusivity and flexibility are intrinsically linked. It's basically impossible to have one without the other. So when you think about, those key ingredients of your culture, like, does diversity and inclusivity matter to you? In which case you have to offer flexible working. And advertise it in places, again, the employer brand side of things is like, do you want a diverse workforce? You can't just be advertising it in places where white middle class people are. You need to be going broader than that. And obviously that's one of the reasons that we work with so many companies like Mars, is because Flexa has a genuinely diverse user base of people that just want flexibility. But that's a kind of a whole other kettle of fish really around inclusivity and flexibility.
Yeah. Another long conversation on that one quite easily.
Yeah, it's a key ingredient of your employer brand if you do want to hire diverse talent. So that's why I always have it as a kind of fundamental pillar is your flexible working, because it comes in the top threes of people's, like, what do they want to see from their employer every single time. So let's get on to questions. So in the interest of efficient question answering, I'll either give a question to you or I'll answer it, depending on who I think is kind of best suited to it. So Alyssa from LinkedIn, because we're putting questions from the LinkedIn Live in here as well, said, as you probably know, Asia is still pretty heavy on the traditional work culture, like 9 till 5, fewer benefits. So her question is, if a company in Asia is striving towards a sort of unconventional work setting, what would your advice be in order to build a strong EVP? Chris, I feel like that's quite a good one for you, given Mars's global presence.
I think that's a great question as well, because whilst, and so one of the biggest challenges you have is you have a huge company like Mars, and you want an EVP to fit that entire company. It's no good having kind of different EVPs for different locations, but there are cultural nuances which mean something isn't offered somewhere or something like that. I think when it comes to building your employer brand in those markets, that research piece becomes key, and making sure those different, especially if it's a global EVP, making sure those people have their voice in those conversations is absolutely key. And then whether it's then kind of taking away from, okay, we're not going to say flexibility as a whole is our is in our EVP, and it is one of those kind of key parts of our employer brand. It's about, okay, how do we build the fact that, I don't know, I'm kind of making this up as I go along as an example, but how do we build and say that as business X, what we do is care about our associates or our employees. And so building that and then going to those markets and saying, does this work for you? How do we then execute that from a recruitment marketing standpoint in your markets with the right narrative, the right messaging, the right creative on the right platforms? And I also think, like, it's very easy for me to say as a white male in the UK, go bold. People will never berate you for going bolder. It will always, you kind of be the trailblazer and be the person that makes that path. If that's what you think is right to do for your organisation and for the people that work for you at that time, go bold.
That's a really good answer. I think also just start small and what you're comfortable with. Like, you don't have to suddenly jump in at the deep end and be like, oh, we're all of a sudden disrupting the whole work culture in our particular country. Like, start small and iterate. That's kind of the best thing. And the most comfortable thing, particularly when you're trying to sell this to senior leadership, which I know can be difficult, is be like, we'd like to start with 1 day a week from home on a Friday and half an hour flexibility so that people can drop their kids off in the morning, and just start with that and be like, communicate that it's a trial and be like, we're going to do this for 3 months and see how it goes. It's way easier to drip feed those kind of things in than spend 3 years trying to make a big plan and then launch it and all of a sudden it's not what you expected it to be. Start small, try and drip feed it, and remember it's iterative. Like, our employer brand has changed enormously over 3 years and we're a really small company. So imagine in a big company with all of those voices and all of those different pressures from different sides, it's going to change enormously. Another question here. So one for me is, I mentioned about EVP is about marketing your employer brand, but most people teams don't have marketing training, and marketing naturally have their own priorities and KPIs. So where do we start? Yeah, I mean, I think it's sort of flipped on its head. Is the employer brand is about marketing your EVP, and totally understand the pressure of like, oh, this is adding another thing to my day job. Start small. You don't have to get marketing involved straight away. Like, actually, a lot of talent teams won't lean on their marketing teams for their employer branding. I think it probably should be a symbiotic relationship, but it's often not. It doesn't have to be. So I would start by making sure that you're clear on what you want to shout about, and then just going and testing it on LinkedIn. Encourage your talent team or your recruiters to explain about why they like working at your company. Some photos of people with kids or a dog or going to the gym, whatever it might be, and start there and see how that starts to go. Because the reach that you'll get there is pretty strong. And then once you feel like you've kind of got that EVP out in the wild, for lack of a better term, then look at other places that you can put it. So obviously come chat to us at Flexa, see if we can help. Or start looking at investing a bit of money into that kind of employer brand marketing side of things, rather than just focusing on paying for recruiting. Direct kind of that middle of funnel recruitment, see if you can reallocate a bit of budget over time. But dip your toe in by just getting people to share their own stories. That's probably the best way that I would say to start. Chris, I know this is actually something we've talked about before. So Danielle says that she loves the idea of employee generated content as it's the most authentic. But how would you recommend starting that chain of activity and that culture of employee sharing?
I think it has to start from somewhere, and I think this is quite often something we see at Mars, is that we're still private, family-owned business. We happen to be one of the world's largest privately family-owned businesses, but because of that, we essentially have been quite secretive in our past and not that forthcoming, and that can give some people a bit of a fear about sharing. And so when I took the role, for me, it was just I get on my LinkedIn and start sharing, and that's kind of where the fame of Barney's come from, and my adventures with Barney, and when I've had a lunch break, or I thought, I really need to get out and about and just get some air, because that's key as well. Like, what is the damage of me going out and missing 20 minutes of being staring at my laptop doing nothing versus going out and getting 20 minutes of fresh air and coming back refreshed? So I think start sharing yourself. Exactly as Molly says, start sharing from somewhere, and then use that. And when you think, for me, there are kind of 2 or 3 big key blockers about employer generated content. It's a fear about what to post. And so by sharing, you're kind of sharing what you're allowed to post and giving other people kind of unconscious permission to do so as well. It's a fear about kind of being judged or something and externally, and the way I always say it is like, this is what you think people are thinking of you, this is what people are actually thinking of you, and quite often that people will perceive your content well, or they'll just scroll past it. And then that's the final two are time. So I get that one fully. There's no real quick win on time, but try and give people the template they need, or show them, even if they're just showing them. I'm not the biggest fan of using this for employee generated content, but ChatGPT, LinkedIn now have generative AI on their posts as well, so that's a great time saver. And the final one is like, am I going to get engagement? And that fear of putting a post out. And Molly and I have this chat quite so irregularly about content, about like, I'll put a post out and no one will like it.
Yeah.
Sometimes it happens. Like how many followers have you got on LinkedIn, Molly? And
about 40,000.
And sometimes you put a post out and no one will like it. It happens. No one's kind of sat there. Again, it's that kind of circle. No one sat there and going, "Oh my God, Molly only got 12 likes on her LinkedIn post." Like something bad.
If the worst is you have to delete it, then it's not that bad.
Exactly. So I think just get started.
Yeah.
It's one of those, like, your comfort zone will grow to that content quite quickly.
And I think you can make it culturally normal quite quickly as well. So like we've set up, and any business that's kind of below about 500 people, even 1,000 can do this. We've set up a Slack channel, which is called engagement. When people have done a post like that, they'll drop it into there. Other people that will spot that will like it. It just gives more visibility to the fact that people are doing that employer brand side of things. And I reckon about 50% of our employees post about that kind of thing regularly. And that wasn't because we asked them to. It was because it became kind of culturally normal. And it's also a great way to build your own personal brand. And as that spotlight is on the personal brand side of things, more and more people are recognizing the importance of it. I've also just shared, because I've written a lot of these tips that we're talking about down into my newsletter in the past. So I just thought I'd share those two different links there. And I often do the kind of how-to guides and summaries of these kind of discussions. So if you do want to subscribe to that, because one of the questions was, how do we stay up to date on trends in recruitment, marketing and branding? One way is signing up to newsletters that will talk about it, following those hashtags on LinkedIn as well. People will chat about it a lot. And also just paying attention to employee generated content on LinkedIn, because you'll see the trends that are working and not working, and engage with that kind of content and follow those influencers, for lack of a better word. But there are loads of them around in the TA and employer branding space. So I'd always suggest that's kind of the best way to stay up to date with it. It doesn't need to be overly academic or theoretical. Sometimes just seeing how people are doing it is actually the best way of learning. So answered that one. And then, oh, this is a good one actually. How do ex-employees influence employer brand? Chris?
I love this one. And I would say, and I actually think someone kind of answered a little bit of this in there. Ex-employees are one of the most important groups of people for your employer brand. And so from a couple of aspects, like one is, why did they leave? And so really understanding, and people always say to me this, but people are going to leave. Yeah, they're going to leave. Like sometimes it's not, they haven't left because of your company. They've left because their circumstances have changed. They may have moved. They want to do something different that isn't at your company. Fine. But really understand from them, if they left because of they're going to a different company that offers something else, is that something you can offer? But again, is it also just, okay, fine, we're parting ways, at this point in your career, it's not quite right. The biggest thing is there are so many, a ton of Glassdoor reviews. And for me, the most powerful Glassdoor reviews come from, and I'm not the biggest fan of Glassdoor reviews because there's a lot of kind of companies that will pay people to do Glassdoor reviews, but the most valuable ones come from people once they've left, because there's no fear of, you can tell by my job title, or my line manager might come to me. There's a real, this is my chance to get it off my chest. And so listen to those. Again, you can't change everything, and you won't want to change everything, but listen to those people and really try to understand what they're saying, and then try to take that feedback on board. I think feedback is it's the cliche, but feedback's a gift. So really try to take that on board and understand, if they're feeling like this, are there other people in the organisation that are feeling like this that haven't left yet?
Yeah.
And that's when you can kind of start to look at both hiring people, but the other aspect of a really strong employer brand is strong retention as well.
Yeah.
Because once you hire them, their expectations before they joined and what they're getting match up perfectly. And so hopefully they won't leave, and you'll be able to retain strong talent. So I think they play a huge part, and really start to listen to those, because it's also, if you think about how many people, I mean, certainly for a business like Mars, how many people have left over the years that will then say, oh, what was it like to work at Mars? And that's impacting your employer brand, whether you like it or not. So get those conversations right and start to really understand. But again, you're not going to get it right every time. And some people don't fit within your organisation, and that's fine. It happens.
Yeah. It's making sure you've attempted in every way possible to treat people fairly. At the end of the day, like whether it's resignation conversations or firing conversations, they're never nice to have. But trying to remember that we're all human and treating it as humanly as possible. Got time for one more question, and it's actually a really good one from Danielle. I have a similar question. So she's asking, when companies have gone through high turnover or redundancies, like how do you protect the brand and turn it around? So I've seen this happen a lot with companies that are either thinking about working with us or have worked with us. I think there's a tendency when you've gone through redundancies or very high turnover to hide, because that feels like the most comfortable thing to do. Whereas actually the point in time that your employer brand is probably the most important is when you've had to make those quite difficult decisions or experience high turnover. So first of all, depends on if it's redundancies, in which case, like, that was obviously a decision that you had to make. So trying to communicate that honestly, like if you're going to hire again, you need to make sure that people aren't scared of joining your company and that you've explained why those redundancies kind of happens, and lean on the positives. So like, again, go speak to your current employees. What do they still enjoy about working there? Use that authentic content to center your employer brand around. Like, don't try and pretend it's something that it's not. If it's high turnover, you really need to understand why that happened and make sure that you're not centering your employer brand on something that's untrue, because high turnover is obviously dissatisfaction, and you want to make sure that you're addressing that while simultaneously shouting about the fact that maybe the things that people are happy with, because your employer brand has to be true. There is no point of you trying to showcase something that's untrue, because otherwise people will be incredibly disappointed and probably leave straight away once they join your company if you've sold them something that it's not actually. So it's just lose-lose. It might feel like it's the right thing to do, but it's definitely not. Try and focus on the positives, address the negatives, but don't disappear, because it will be much, much harder to gain that momentum back up again. And it's quite suspicious as well if people are following your company. So try to focus on the true positives, and really get to the bottom of why those bad things have happened. That is kind of all of the time up now. Thank you so much, Chris. It was a really, really good discussion. We couldn't have Rosie here with us as well to add a bit of another angle, and probably mean that I wouldn't have been speaking so much. But really, really appreciated you sharing all of those insights with us and sparing the time as well. We didn't get to answer all of your questions. So I'm happy for you to message me on LinkedIn and I can give you an answer via there. Chris, are you happy for people to do the same?
Yeah, definitely.
Perfect. So do connect with us on LinkedIn and drop us a message. But otherwise, thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Chris. And look forward to hopefully seeing everyone at another webinar in the not too distant future. Cool. Take care. Bye.